Well, let's get more analysis, and we can speak to our next guest today, who is Lieutenant General David Leakey, former Director General of the European Union Military Staff. He joins us from the United Kingdom. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Always a pleasure talking to you. It's been a very busy 5 days, hasn't it, with regards to diplomacy and the efforts to bring about an end to this war in Ukraine. Are you encouraged by what you've been seeing and hearing by way of the diplomatic efforts made by the Trump administration?
Yes, I am. I'm very encouraged that by two things. One is that the Europeans and the US are now working, if they're not on the same page, they're in the same chapter at least. There are bound to be some disagreements on the policy and the terms of the settlement and so on. But by and large, they seem to be on the same page, if not the same chapter. I'm also encouraged that President Zelensky has been included in this. It's a multilateral atmosphere in which these talks are taking place. And that's vital because Russia and Ukraine and the US are not the only stakeholders. This is a European security problem, and the European leaders need to be deeply engaged. There's another reason, and that is that the US has said they won't put boots on the ground and they won't get directly engaged in this as regards security guarantees for whatever peace agreement or ceasefire agreement is landed on. And therefore, it requires the Europeans to be directly engaged, particularly in setting the conditions and then the mission for whatever security guarantees, particularly on the ground in the region, are made.
I want to talk to you a bit more about security guarantees in just a moment, but one area where it seemed that there was a bit of a difference in opinion as to what the right way to proceed was between the Europeans and the Americans was on the issue of a ceasefire. President Trump, following his talks with President Putin on Friday in Alaska, seems to be of the view that we can leapfrog from where we are now straight to the peace deal and not have a ceasefire agreement. The Europeans seem to think it was important that they got their point across that they would like one. Do you think it's significant there'll be no ceasefire?
My experience, and I commanded twice in Bosnia for the stabilization and peace implementation forces in Bosnia in 1995 and 2004, following the Dayton Peace Agreement, which brought peace to the Bosnian conflict. And I've had experience of quite a few other ends to wars where I've been involved directly or indirectly. And my experience is that you need a honeymoon, if I can put it that way. In other words, from the moment that there is a general agreement that you're going to have peace, it normally takes time to work out the details of that, and therefore there has to be a ceasefire. I'll give you an example of this, and that is in Bosnia in 1995, the US managed to get all three of the warring factions and the supporting states behind them, Serbia, Croatia, got them to agree that the war had played itself out. There needed now to be a peace agreement. They all agreed, and a ceasefire was agreed immediately, but it took another 2 months before the peace agreement was finally signed. And the peace agreement, the so-called Dayton Accord, took 4 weeks of negotiations between the parties, and the security guarantees, which included the Europeans, it included the UK, Russia, France, Germany, and the European Union with the US, all negotiating together, actually locked up in one of the air bases in Dayton, Ohio, where we were corralled for what they call proximity talks, which means you live in a wild enclave, imprisoned in there, and you're told to beat out the peace agreement until you've done it, and then you can come out. And that's what happened. That took a month, and that was Bosnia. Now, we haven't got an agreement, so far as we know, on the general principles. So the biggest general principle of this regards territory. And are there going to be territory swaps? And is that just a territory agreement, or is it a sovereignty agreement? And so the nature of this and the details, particularly, you may have heard President Trump, during his meeting with the European leaders or his commentary afterwards, talking about the exact percentage of the Donbass which the Russians on that day controlled. I think the figure he quoted was 79%. Now, if there is going to be a division of territories, and I look back again to Bosnia in 1995, the percentages agreed about which of the warring factions would have what percentage of Bosnia. It took a very long time to draw the lines on the maps to delineate where those sort of front lines, or not front, we knew where the front lines were, but the front lines weren't the same as where the territorial allocation was given. And that we needed a ceasefire to buffer us between stopping the fighting on day one and implementing the terms and the details of the ceasefire agreement, which happened on about, I think it was about day 90. So it can take a long time. So I'm very surprised that there won't be a ceasefire followed by a peace agreement. But if the Zelensky, Trump, Putin talks can deliver all the necessary headlines, so that there can be a ceasefire and a peace agreement straight away.
Okay.
But as part of that peace agreement, there has to be a transition from where things are today, where the fighting in the front line is today, and where the territorial limits are going to be as part of the peace agreement. There will be a time frame because the troops have to withdraw or indeed advance. And it may be that there are some details about removing some of the defensive measures that have been put in place. That could be part of it. For example, lifting minefields that have been laid by one or other of the protagonists. So there's a lot of detail to be covered in here.
Yeah, and I mean, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, the fact that President Putin seems to have successfully persuaded President Trump last Friday, because President Trump was talking about a ceasefire until last Friday, now he's not talking about a ceasefire. The fact that President Putin doesn't seem to want one, I mean, shouldn't we be reading something into that, and something rather cynical?
Well, I don't want to be too rude about President Putin, but he and his diplomats and generals have been capricious and mendacious and mercurial throughout this. And not just this recent 2.5 years of the Ukraine conflict, but if you go back to the invasion and the occupation by Russia of Crimea, after that there were the accords agreed on that on all sorts of terms by which the Russians remained in Crimea. But the Russians have reneged on almost every single article that was agreed between Russia and Ukraine after that. So in some senses, we shouldn't enjoy a sense of achievement on an agreement with Putin until such time as he has signed on the dotted line, and until such time as not just the headlines, but some of the details and timetables are agreed. As I think Donald Trump has said many times, until the deal is done, the deal isn't done. And but I just don't think that the Russians. Well, let me answer your question directly about the ceasefire and the peace agreement. I think it will take a long time for the peace agreement to be agreed. The reason Putin doesn't want a ceasefire is that he wants to continue the pressure on Ukraine and the attacks and the advances he's making in the Donbass region. He wants to continue that until the absolute last possible moment. And that's why he doesn't want a ceasefire. Because if today or tomorrow or next week, they agree that they've agreed, say, the outline headlines of the deal, that there are going to be some territory swaps, it may be in certain percentages, that there are going to be some general security guarantees, you might get some headlines of the agreement. And Putin will say, fine, well, we won't have a ceasefire until we've done the detail on that. And the detail may take another month or two to work out. And that's the beauty of a ceasefire. At least if you've got the headlines of agreement, you declare a ceasefire, the fighting then stops. And then you've got time to work out the detail. Okay. But again, who would have any guarantee that the ceasefire would hold? Traditionally, ceasefires are breached by both sides, and I've had experience of that in many of the operations that I've experienced and seen, either directly or indirectly. So I think we've got a way to go before we discover what the conditions are going to be before security guarantees are agreed.
Okay,
You probably want to talk about security guarantees.
I do in just a moment, but I just want to pick up finally on a couple of points you've made, which is that it sounds from what you're saying and how these things play out with ceasefires leading to peace deals. The fact that President Putin and his forces seem to have the upper hand currently on the ground in Ukraine. They want to play a long game so they can continue capturing territory so that when a deal is signed, obviously they've got as much territory as they can possibly capture. But does any of this make it sound to you like President Putin wants a deal? I mean, what do you think the chances are of these bilat and trilat meetings even happening?
This is a purely personal view. I would put it at 50% as at today, 50% chance of it happening. And the reason I say 50% on the one hand is because President Putin has insisted consistently over the last months, weeks, and years for that matter, that his aim of this operation is to subjugate Ukraine and bring it into the Russian Federation, which is where he believes it historically, politically, militarily, strategically belongs. Now, he has not deviated from that aim at all, and he's not renounced that aim. So that makes me 50% skeptical about whether he really wants a peace agreement or whether he's just going to go through the motions and blame everybody else for the peace talks breaking down. Well, on the other hand, the 50% that argues that we will get a deal is that the cost to Russia of continuing this war, even as things stand at today, is enormous. The Russians have suffered 1 million casualties of dead, missing in action, wounded. 1 million is an awful lot of people. And if he is to go on pursue his ambition without a peace agreement, then the cost of that in human terms is going to rise exponentially. And moreover, the military cost as well. It is extremely expensive. And behind that is the cost to his economy. The Russian economy is on a war footing. We know it's been subsisting on considerable reserves that it built up before the war, but those are beginning to run out. Its economy is not doing as well, and for the future of the economy, it can't survive indefinitely on a war economy footing. It needs to establish a non-war economy footing for the benefit of its well-being and the welfare and the growth of its society. And to that, I would add, if the Americans, the Europeans, and other countries weigh in with some really effective sanctions, then those two factors of the military cost and the cost to the Russian economy of sanctions, I think that's the other 50%. So I think the Russians find themselves caught between, we are really going to, by pursuing this Ukraine objective now, we are really going to hamper the Russian economy, the Russian state. We're going to bankrupt ourselves on this. And I think that's the issue for the Russians. What worries me about it is that whatever peace agreement is made will not be an enduring one. We saw that after Crimea. It didn't take the Russians very long to breach all the agreements, or most of the agreements of that, including their invasion of Ukraine. So I think they'll be hell-bent on having a peace agreement, and then they will find some excuse in years to come, maybe 2, 4, 8, 10 years, probably 8, 10 years is my guess, when everybody's forgotten, there's a generation has forgotten that this war happened. The generation of this who makes this peace agreement will be 2 presidents further down the line in the US. They won't remember exactly the details and the drama that went on. And hey presto, a bit like Crimea, the Russians will have another go, unless the Ukrainians have really rock solid security guarantees for this peace agreement. And that will involve we'll need to see what that is going to be involved. I mean, we can spend the next 20 minutes speculating on the spectrum of options of security guarantees, because they are a huge spectrum of options. I mean, just to give you one example of how wide the spectrum is, it's not just on the land, boots on the ground, which a lot of people talk about, but it's policing from the air, it's satellite imagery, it's intelligence sharing, all these sorts of things. When NATO went into Bosnia to implement the Dayton Accord, which brought peace to Bosnia, the plan was to put 40,000 NATO troops into Bosnia. Now, the length of the front lines and the square kilometerage of that whole operation is minuscule compared to what is going on in Ukraine. It's on a completely industrial scale in Ukraine compared to, if I can put it that way, a village scale in as it was in Bosnia in 1995. So if you were really to put boots on the ground to act as a tripwire, a security guarantee that could intervene to help implement and impose the details of the peace agreement, then you'd be talking about an enormous force, and that's simply not practicable. So I am sure that the European military chiefs who've been meeting over the last months and making up plans will have a spectrum of operations, a spectrum of potential plans that they can do, and underpinning each of those will be force levels, command and control organizations, intelligence sharing organizations, and probably some draft troop contribution ideas as well.
Yeah, I mean, what's extraordinary is that throughout this process, this diplomatic process, the discussion about a ceasefire, no ceasefire, the concessions that have been made on Ukraine's behalf verbally by the US president, I mean, all along, it sounds like, you know, everyone is dancing to Russia's tune here. And even on the subject of security guarantees, the Russians have said something today along the lines of security guarantees without our involvement and running them by us first, or words to that effect, aren't worth the paper they're written on. I mean, doesn't it sound rather extraordinary, the extent to which European leaders and the United States are tiptoeing around what might or might not be acceptable to the Russians when it comes to security guarantees?
Yes, they are tiptoeing around it, and I think Russia is going to play the long game on this, and I think the reason they're playing for time is that they won't be at all disappointed. In one sense, they won't be disappointed if these peace talks break down, and they will blame the United States and primarily and the Europeans in equal measure for the breakdown, and they will say, well, your for example, they could say your security guarantees are totally unacceptable. We've always said that Ukraine can't be a member of NATO, but what you're setting up is Ukraine de facto being defended by NATO, and that's unacceptable to Russians. It's unacceptable to Russia. So go back and think again. Well, you know, it's quite hard to. The Europeans have had this before in other parts of the world where a security force has been required, and the host countries, if I can put it that way, have not agreed to it being either a NATO organization or a US-led organization. A small example of that would be in Chad and the Central African Republic back in about 2009-10, I think it was, when there was a general agreement by the governments of Chad and Central African Republic that they wanted an international force to come in and police their borders, or help police their borders, to stop the Darfur conflict spreading into the Central African Republic and Chad. But for various complex regional political reasons, the US was not an acceptable force nor acceptable leadership. Likewise, NATO for the same reason. And the UN couldn't do it because they were discredited in that part of the world for other reasons. And it needed an organization that could provide the command and control and the political infrastructure to put that force in place, which was why the European Union took up the cudgels and did it. In fact, I helped set that, didn't help set it up. I set it up as the Director General of the European Union Military Staff. I set up the military side of it anyway. And And I think the same may happen with the Russian peace agreement. If the Russians don't want the Americans and the Americans don't want to be on the ground, the Russians may say it's unacceptable to have a NATO command and control system running this operation. Then it may be that we have to look for other ways of running the operation. The European Union would be one way of doing it, but even that's anathema to the Russians, because the Russians don't want the Ukrainians defended either by NATO, and they don't really want them in the European Union either. Sure. So I think the Russians will keep on throwing problems back at the Western alliance, if I can put it that way, to play this long, to keep kicking it into the long grass, and blaming the West on not making or offering arrangements that are remotely acceptable to Russia. So, but I go back to the original point. The question is, does Russia want peace or not? On the one hand, are they prepared to carry on with their strategic objectives and pay the cost for that? Or on the other hand, are they prepared to stop at where they are now in order not to compromise the economic position of the country?
All right, and just lastly, I mean, you were one of the early advocates of heavy military hardware being made available to help Ukraine win the war. You're quoted as such, even 2 years ago. I mean, it doesn't seem like Ukraine was given the support it needed when it needed it, which was in those early days. I mean, does this all look to you like a series of missed opportunities? And if so, how and where would you apportion blame?
Well, I think the problem was, back in the early days, it's almost hard to remember how it happened. The assistance given to the Ukrainians took a long time to ramp up because, and this was one of the problems. For example, take artillery and tanks and armored fighting vehicles generally, infantry carrying vehicles and so on. None of the European member states really shared many of these in common. So the British tanks and the French tanks were different. And so Ukrainians had to be brought across to the UK and France in order to be trained on not just how to operate a tank, but how to service and maintain them and put spare parts into them. And a supply chain had to be set up from the UK to service those tanks on the front line in Ukraine. And that took a very, very long time. People underestimate that. On the other hand, some of the support to Ukraine was instantaneous. So a lot of, if I can put it, soft support, so intelligence sharing, communication sharing, but particularly intelligence sharing, that was instantaneous. And the supply of, for example, ammunition to Ukraine and cash from the European Union, that was instantaneous. Where there were some problems, and I think criticism of the Europeans is justified, where there were problems were some member states, some European member states, particularly European Union member states, were unwilling because they were equivocal about their support for Ukraine. Germany had severe reservations, partly for historical, but mostly political reasons. Hungary, as you know, was on Russia's side, as Slovakia. So the Europeans weren't anyway unanimous and together, and that made for its own particular difficulties.
Okay. All right. We're going to leave it there because we're out of time. But thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Really a pleasure talking to you, as always, Lieutenant General David Leakey. Thank you for your time, sir.